My manager Ryan screamed that I was too stupid to push buttons in the right order, while I struggled with our ancient register system as a new seasonal hire. When I asked him to show me again, since training was only 5 minutes, he slammed the scanner on the counter and said, maybe if I'd finished high school I could understand basic instructions. What he didn't know was that I was actually the head of employee relations wearing a hidden body camera sent by corporate to investigate why 3 stores had lost their entire staff in a single month. My manager screaming insults at me had no idea I was investigating him for corporate. I'd been working undercover at different locations for 2 weeks as part of our corporate investigation into why 3 stores had lost their entire staff in a single month. Wearing the same red polo and khakis as every other floor employee, I looked exactly like what I was pretending to be, a clueless seasonal hire who couldn't figure out the register. What the store management didn't know was that I was the head of employee relations documenting every labor violation for legal action and potential terminations. The store manager Ryan found me struggling with the ancient register system that corporate refused to update and immediately announced to everyone in earshot, "This is why I hate seasonal hires. Too stupid to push buttons in the right order." When I asked him to show me again since the training had been just 5 minutes long, he grabbed the scanner from my hand and slammed it on the counter. "Maybe if you'd finished high school, you could understand basic instructions." My chest tightened, but I kept my expression neutral, tapping the hidden body camera in my name tag to make sure it was recording. We'd had 7 wrongful termination lawsuits from this location alone, but regional management said employees were lying until I volunteered to see for myself. The assistant manager Nicole joined in, telling Ryan loud enough for all the customers to hear that I was proof they needed to stop hiring these people who couldn't handle real work. "Look at her," she said while I was still standing right there. "Probably thought retail would be easy money, but her brain can't even process how to make change. This is what affirmative action gets us." I bit my tongue and mentally noted the blatant discrimination while she continued her rant about how corporate forced them to hire charity cases. Ryan added that I'd probably last 2 days before quitting like all the others who couldn't handle honest feedback about their stupidity. When Black Friday hit, Ryan gathered the morning crew and pointed at me as an example of who would definitely crack under pressure. "Ruby here can barely handle a Tuesday afternoon," he announced, "so everyone else needs to cover for her incompetence. When she inevitably screws up, just send the customers to someone with a functioning brain. Not that anyone else here seems to be all that much smarter." The floor supervisor took this as permission to treat me like his personal servant, making me clean the bathrooms between customers, even though that wasn't my job. When I mentioned I was supposed to be on register, he laughed and said, "You can't handle the register anyway. At least with a mop, you can't mess up too badly. Though knowing you'll probably find a way." Another employee whispered to me that she knew what I was going through. She'd been their favorite target before I came along. Nicole started a game where managers would send me to different departments for made-up items just to watch me search frantically. They'd stand at the customer service desk laughing and timing how long it took me to realize the left-handed scanner or shelf stretcher didn't exist. When customers complained about the wait, Ryan would loudly say, "Sorry, we're stuck with Ruby today. Corporate makes us keep the slow ones." During my break, which they kept forgetting to give me until I'd worked 6 hours straight, I sat in the stockroom documenting everything in my phone. The supervisor walked in and saw me typing, immediately assuming I was texting. He grabbed my phone and threatened to smash it, saying I was stealing company time. "This is why people like you stay poor," he said. "No work ethic, no intelligence, just expecting handouts." Ryan decided to make an example of me during the all-hands meeting. He pulled me to the front and used me to demonstrate what not to do, having me roleplay while he pointed out every mistake to the other employees. "See how Ruby stands? Like she's half asleep? See how she talks to customers? Like she's confused by basic English. This is your reminder to be better than this." Nicole added that they kept me on as a charity case, and everyone should be grateful they weren't as mentally limited as I was. She actually made me stand there while she quizzed me on store policies I'd never been trained on, then used my wrong answers as proof that some people just weren't meant for anything beyond mopping floors. When a customer collapsed in the main aisle during Black Friday rush, Ryan screamed at me to get out of the way and let real employees handle it, but nobody moved to help, all frozen in panic. I pushed past him and started CPR, using my actual training while the supervisor yelled that I was probably making it worse and they'd get sued because an idiot touched a customer. The woman started breathing again just as the paramedics arrived, and right behind them came our chief operations officer with a regional director. Ryan started to approach them with his fake smile, but the COO walked straight past him to me. "Excellent work as always, Ruby," she said loudly. "I've been watching the investigation footage from my office. Legal's here to collect your evidence and will be conducting termination interviews immediately." Ryan's face went white as he suddenly realized every single thing he'd said and done had been recorded by corporate's head investigator. The look on his face shifted from shock to pure rage as he lunged toward me, but security stepped between us before he could reach me. Nicole started screaming that this was entrapment while Marcus just stood there with his mouth hanging open, watching his whole world fall apart. Thomas from legal was already pulling out termination paperwork while Elena motioned for me to follow her to the back office. The remaining employees watched in stunned silence as security escorted Ryan, Nicole, and Marcus out of the building, their keycards deactivated before they even reached the parking lot. I spent the next 3 hours in the office going through my recordings with Thomas and Elena, showing them every single violation I'd documented over the past 2 weeks. Elena kept shaking her head and muttering about how she should have known something was wrong when so many people quit. The next morning, Ryan's wife Karen burst into our corporate headquarters demanding to see me, screaming at the receptionist that I'd ruined their lives over what she called harmless jokes. Security had to physically remove her from the building while she yelled that her husband was right about people like me not belonging in management positions. Elena found me in the break room afterward and sat down with a folder full of termination records from Ryan's store. She showed me the statistics she'd been ignoring for months, with 73% of employees employees quitting within 6 months of being hired. She admitted she'd dismissed all the complaints as coming from difficult employees who couldn't handle tough management. 3 days later, I joined a video call with the remaining store employees who'd elected a temporary supervisor from their own ranks while corporate searched for new management. I started to apologize for lying about who I was, but they cut me off with applause, and one older woman said I'd given them back their dignity. That same afternoon, I got a call from Thomas telling me Marcus had been contacting former employees trying to convince them to take back their complaints. We'd been recording those calls too, and Thomas immediately filed for restraining orders while adding witness tampering to the charges. Our IT department found something even worse when they went through the manager's work computers and discovered a group chat called the Firing Squad. Ryan, Nicole, and Marcus had been taking bets on how fast they could make new employees quit, with a whole scoring system that gave extra points for making someone cry in front of customers. During Nicole's exit interview 2 days later, she accidentally let slip that they'd been shaving hours off employee time cards to make their labor costs look better to corporate. Thomas's eyes went wide as he realized this wasn't just discrimination anymore, but wage theft affecting hundreds of employees over at least 2 years. That night, I woke up at 3 in the morning covered in sweat from a nightmare where I was back in the store and nobody believed I was really from corporate. My husband found me at the kitchen table going through all the footage again, making sure I hadn't missed anything that could help the employees get justice. He gently closed my laptop and reminded me that I'd already gotten them, that the evidence was solid and the terminations were final. A week later, a local news station picked up the story after someone's cell phone video of me doing CPR went viral online. They wanted interviews, but Thomas told us to stay quiet until the full investigation was complete, though Ryan's face was already all over social media as the manager who refused to help a dying customer. Former employees started meeting at a coffee shop near the mall, creating their own support group to deal with the trauma from working under Ryan's management. I went to one meeting without telling them who I was, just listening as a young woman described how she hadn't been able to work retail since quitting 6 months ago. The stories kept getting worse, with people talking about anxiety attacks, depression, and nightmares about going back to that store. Then Ryan's lawyer sent corporate a letter threatening to sue us for defamation and illegal recording, claiming we'd violated his client's privacy rights. Thomas actually laughed when he read it and sent back copies of the consent forms every employee signs on their first day, agreeing to potential monitoring for quality assurance and training purposes. 3 days later, the Department of Labor showed up at corporate with boxes of paperwork and serious faces. There's something really strange about Ruby being the head of employee relations, but having to pretend she can't work a register. I wonder if she actually struggled with that old system or just acted confused. They'd gotten multiple complaints about unpaid overtime and missing breaks at Ryan's store over the past 2 years. The investigator sat in our conference room going through time cards and schedules while I handed over my recordings of Ryan bragging about making people clock out before finishing their shifts. He'd stolen over $400,000 in wages by forcing employees to work off the clock and denying legally required meal breaks. Thomas kept shaking his head as the numbers added up because this wasn't just toxic management anymore. This was criminal wage theft that could mean jail time. While sorting through my body camera footage for the labor department, I found something I'd missed before in the stockroom recordings. Ryan had cornered a young cashier named Sarah against the shelves, telling her she could get better shifts if she was nice to him after work. Her face showed pure panic as he blocked her exit and kept touching her shoulder while describing what being nice meant. She quit the next day according to the records, and I immediately sent the footage to both our legal team and the police department. Elena called me into her office that afternoon to discuss my next undercover assignment at another problem store in Cleveland. I couldn't focus on what she was saying because I kept thinking about all the other employees still trapped in similar situations at our remaining locations. I told her I wanted to keep doing this kind of investigation work, but we needed to be proactive instead of waiting for lawsuits to pile up. She agreed and started planning a program where I'd rotate through stores before problems got this bad, catching toxic managers early instead of after they'd destroyed dozens of lives. 2 weeks after everything went public, the mall management called David directly about their concerns over the negative publicity affecting their holiday shopping numbers. They wanted guarantees that our new management team wouldn't create more scandals that would drive customers away from the entire shopping center. David personally assured them we'd already replaced the entire management structure with experienced professionals who understood both customer service and basic human decency. That same day, Nicole's husband Mark started posting all over social media that I was a corporate spy who'd entrapped innocent managers just trying to run a business. He posted my full name and my actual photo from my corporate ID badge, calling me a liar who destroyed good people's careers for a promotion. Within 3 hours, my personal Facebook was flooded with death threats from strangers who believed his version that Ryan and Nicole were victims of corporate greed. People were messaging that they knew where I lived and would make me pay for ruining an honest man's life. My husband came home from work to find me in tears reading message after message describing what they wanted to do to me. He immediately started installing new locks on all our doors and setting up security cameras while I worked from home instead of going to the office. Every delivery truck that pulled up made us both jump, wondering if this was someone coming to follow through on their threats. He sat next to me on the couch that night and said quietly that this wasn't what he'd signed up for when I took this job. But then he squeezed my hand and told me he wasn't going anywhere, that we'd get through this together no matter how scary it got. The next morning, Jasmine called me sobbing because someone had spray-painted liar across her car windshield in red paint. They'd left a note under her wiper blade saying she'd pay for helping destroy good people who were just trying to make a living. The harassment campaign was spreading to every former employee who'd come forward with their stories about Ryan and Nicole's abuse. Marcus had gotten similar threats at his new job, and 2 other employees had their tires slashed in their apartment parking lots. 3 weeks after the story broke, the FBI showed up at my house to discuss the interstate nature of the threats we'd been receiving. They'd traced several of the death threat messages to IP addresses in other states, making this a federal case of witness intimidation and conspiracy. Their tech team found connections between the threatening accounts and email addresses linked to Ryan's brother in Texas and Nicole's cousin in Michigan. They were building a case that this was an organized campaign to silence witnesses in an ongoing investigation, which carried serious federal charges. While reviewing evidence with the FBI agent, I got an encrypted email from an anonymous sender with several PDF attachments. The documents showed Ryan's employment history at his previous retail job in Indiana, where he'd been quietly let go after multiple harassment complaints. His former employer had paid settlements to 3 employees, but never reported anything to prevent him from just moving to our company and starting over. The anonymous sender claimed to be someone from that company's HR department who couldn't stand watching him hurt more people when they could have stopped him years ago. The grocery store trip the following week should have been simple, but corporate insisted I take a security guard after the latest round of threats. We were in the cereal aisle when I spotted Nicole at the other end, her cart half full of groceries. She locked eyes with me and her face went completely blank. No anger or fear or anything I could read. She abandoned her cart right there in the middle of the aisle and walked straight out of the store without saying a word. My bodyguard immediately texted the incident details to Thomas and suggested we leave through the back entrance just to be safe. The parking lot was almost empty as we walked to my car, and I kept checking over my shoulder even though the bodyguard was right there with me. 3 days later, Thomas called to tell me Ryan had been arrested at the police station downtown on sexual harassment charges. The young woman from the stockroom footage had agreed to testify after seeing the news coverage. Within hours of his arrest, 3 more women came forward with similar stories about Ryan making them do things to keep their jobs. The detective handling the case said they'd never seen someone with so much evidence against them, thanks to all my recordings. David called me that night while I was making dinner. "You know you've probably saved lives," he said quietly. "Not just the customer you helped, but employees who might have." He didn't finish, but we both knew what he meant. The next morning, Thomas sent me an email that made my jaw drop. The forensic accountants had found a second set of books hidden on Ryan's computer. He'd been stealing from the company for years through fake returns and made-up vendor accounts. The total was over $200,000, all sitting in offshore accounts he thought nobody would find. His whole life was falling apart faster than anyone expected. A month after everything came out, corporate made me go to therapy as part of their protocol for undercover operations. The therapist sat across from me in her small office and asked if I regretted taking the assignment. I thought about Jasmine crying in the conference room, the young woman in the stockroom, all the employees finally speaking up. "No," I told her. "Marcus got arrested 2 weeks later at his new job at a hardware store across town. The police walked right in during the morning shift and cuffed him in front of all his coworkers for witness tampering and conspiracy to commit wage theft. As they put him in the squad car, he was yelling that I'd set him up, that none of it was real. The labor board started looking into every store in Ryan's district after finding the same patterns everywhere. Elena got placed on administrative leave while they reviewed how she'd missed all the warning signs. They asked me to testify about everything I'd seen across multiple locations. I started noticing things at home that I'd never worried about before. I was checking locks 3 or 4 times before bed, installing cameras at every door, taking different routes to work each day. My husband suggested maybe we should think about moving to a different city. They don't get to win that way, I told him. The fear was real, but I wasn't going to let them chase me from my own life. Thomas helped me set up an anonymous hotline for employees who wanted to report problems without giving their names. Within 2 days, we had over 200 calls and emails from workers at stores all across the region. People were finally feeling safe enough to speak up about what they'd been going through for years. 6 weeks after the first arrests, Nicole got picked up at the federal courthouse on wire fraud charges related to the wage theft scheme. Her lawyer tried to argue she was just following Ryan's orders, but the prosecutor had emails showing she'd actually started many of the schemes herself. She'd been stealing from employees' paychecks and keeping the money in accounts under her mother's name. That same week, I got a call from someone I'd never expected to hear from. Ryan's former assistant manager from his previous job had kept copies of everything before she quit 2 years ago. She'd been too scared to come forward before, but seeing him finally get arrested gave her the courage to share what she knew. She had documents showing he'd done the exact same things at 3 different stores over the past decade. The documents painted a clear pattern that corporate couldn't ignore anymore. 3 weeks later, the store reopened under new management, and the woman they picked had started as a cashier 20 years ago before working her way up through every position. She called me personally to invite me to the reopening ceremony, and when I walked through those automatic doors again, the whole place felt different. Mark's social media crusade against corporate accountability is quite the plot twist. Nothing says my wife is innocent, like doxing witnesses and organizing death threats across state lines. The employees had pooled their money to put up a bronze plaque by the entrance that read, "Dignity and respect work here," with the date of the new beginning underneath. I stood there reading it when Jasmine tapped my shoulder, asking if I had time for coffee at the place across the street. We sat in a corner booth while she stirred sugar into her cup and told me about her new job at a credit union where they actually trained people properly. She'd been seeing a therapist twice a week for what they called workplace PTSD, and her hands shook a little when she said the worst part was how she'd started believing she really was stupid, that she deserved the treatment. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand while she wiped her eyes with a napkin. 2 days later, Thomas called to warn me that Ryan's lawyer had subpoenaed my entire employment history going back 15 years. They'd found a harassment complaint I'd filed at my very first job out of college when a supervisor kept making comments about my body, and now they were trying to paint me as someone who seeks out these situations for attention and lawsuits. Thomas said not to worry since the evidence spoke for itself, but I spent that night going through old emails and documents to prepare for whatever they might throw at me. The next morning brought even bigger news when the Department of Justice contacted our legal team about joining the investigation. They were looking at potential RICO charges for systematic wage theft. across not just our stores, but an entire network of retail locations where managers had been skimming hours and pocketing the difference. What started as one toxic manager was revealing corruption that went up multiple levels of regional management. I had to go back to the store one more time to retrieve some evidence files from the old manager's office that we'd missed in the initial sweep. Even with a new management and fresh paint on the walls, walking through those doors made my chest tight and my breathing shallow. The bathroom Marcus had made me clean still smelled like industrial bleach, and I had to step outside for fresh air before I could finish gathering the documents. My husband noticed I wasn't sleeping well and suggested we try counseling together since this whole thing had affected both of us. 2 months after everything came out, we sat on a therapist's couch while he admitted he'd been having nightmares about something happening to me during the undercover work. He said I was so convincing as a victim that sometimes he forgot I was acting, and he'd lie awake wondering if I was really okay or just putting on a brave face. The therapist helped us work through the fact that even though I'd been pretending, the verbal abuse had still been real and left real marks on both of us. A week later came the deposition where Ryan's lawyer spent 4 hours aggressively questioning my methods and suggesting I'd encourage the discriminatory behavior to get better evidence. He paced back and forth waving printed emails, demanding to know if I'd deliberately acted incompetent to provoke reactions. I stayed calm and pointed to the body camera footage from my very first hour on the job before I'd even had a chance to do anything wrong, where Ryan was already calling me stupid and worthless. The lawyer tried to argue that I should have identified myself immediately instead of letting it continue, but Thomas objected and pointed out that workplace investigations require documentation of pattern behavior, not single incidents. After the deposition, Thomas walked me to my car and mentioned that 3 other companies had reached out wanting to hire me to investigate their workplace cultures. He shook his head with something like admiration and said I'd become the corporate world's worst nightmare, an executive who actually cares about workers and is willing to do something about it. Despite legal's strong advice to stay quiet, I agreed to one television interview at the local news station, not to discuss the ongoing case, but to talk about recognizing workplace abuse in general. The reporter asked me what advice I'd give to people in toxic work situations, and I looked straight at the camera and said, if your manager makes you feel worthless, that's not normal and it's not okay. And the most important thing you can do is document everything. The interview aired on a Tuesday night, and by Wednesday morning, Nicole's family had filed a civil suit against me personally for intentional infliction of emotional distress and invasion of privacy. Their lawyer held a press conference claiming I'd destroyed a loving mother's life over what they called typical workplace dynamics that happen in every retail store. Thomas assured me the corporate lawyers would handle it and that the suit was just a desperate attempt to muddy the waters before the criminal trial. 10 weeks later, I sat in the prosecutor's office watching them file 15 separate charges against Ryan, including sexual harassment, wage theft, and embezzlement. The stack of evidence folders covered the entire conference table, and each one had dozens of witness statements from employees who'd finally felt safe enough to come forward. Nicole faced 8 charges of her own, while Marcus, who'd started cooperating the moment the FBI showed up at his door, worked out a plea deal in exchange for testifying against both of them. The prosecutor showed me security footage they'd pulled from the store's own cameras that Ryan didn't know recorded audio, capturing him bragging about skimming from the registers and blaming it on cashiers he'd fired. I drove to the hospital where the woman I'd given CPR to was finishing her cardiac rehab program. She grabbed my hand the second I walked in and told me she'd been following every news article about the case. Her exact words were that I'd saved her twice, once from dying and once from ever shopping at that horrible place again. But what really got me was when she showed me the letter she'd written to corporate about how the managers just stood there while she was dying. The company's annual leadership conference happened 3 weeks later, and I couldn't walk 10 feet without someone stopping me to either congratulate me or stare at me like I was some kind of spy. One regional manager actually asked, half joking but clearly nervous, how they could know I wasn't investigating them right now. That's when it hit me that I'd never be just another employee at company events again, because everyone would always wonder if I was there to catch them doing something wrong. David pulled me aside during lunch to show me the data from our new anonymous hotline, which had received over 300 complaints in just 2 months. The pattern was clear as day, with the highest performing stores generating the most reports about toxic management and employee abuse. He announced the Culture Reform Initiative that afternoon, requiring every store manager to complete 40 hours of training on workplace respect and implementing monthly audits by third-party consultants. My husband called me at work the next day, his voice shaking as he told me Ryan had shown up at his office parking garage, claiming he just wanted to talk and explain his side of the story. Security footage showed Ryan had been sitting in his car next to my husband's vehicle for 2 hours before a guard noticed and called the police. They arrested him on the spot for violating the restraining order, and the judge revoked his bail immediately, sending him to county jail to wait for trial. 3 months after everything came out, I spent 12 hours in depositions listening to former employees describe the panic attacks they'd have before every shift and the prescriptions they needed just to get through the workday. One young woman broke down describing how she'd tried to kill herself after Nicole humiliated her in front of the entire store for accidentally dropping a box of merchandise. The lawyer tallied up the civil lawsuits, which had grown to over $10 million in damages, with more employees joining the class action every week. Corporate asked me to develop a company-wide training program for identifying workplace abuse, and as I put together the materials, I kept recognizing situations from other stores I'd visited over the years. Things I'd written off as personality conflicts or tough management styles were actually the same warning signs I'd documented at Ryan's store, but I'd been too focused on other priorities to see the pattern. My therapist helped me work through the guilt during our sessions, especially about all the employees who'd suffered before I went undercover. She kept reminding me that I couldn't save everyone, but I'd saved the ones I could, and that had to be enough. Jasmine sent me a photo from her new job at a marketing firm where she'd just been promoted to shift supervisor after only 4 months. Her message said she never never thought she'd be able to trust a boss again, but she was learning that not everyone was like Ryan and Nicole. The prosecutor called that evening with huge news about Nicole's case. Her plea bargain had completely fallen apart when they discovered she'd been moving money to accounts in the Cayman Islands for the past 3 years. The wage theft wasn't just about making sales numbers look better, because she'd been taking a cut of every dollar she stole from employees' paychecks. They upgraded her charges to include money laundering and racketeering, which meant she was looking at 20 years minimum if convicted. 4 months after everything came out, I got a report showing the store's sales had jumped 30% under the new manager corporate sent in. The employees actually smiled now, and customers noticed the difference. Corporate turned it into this big case study about workplace culture that they made every district manager read. I was eating dinner at a steakhouse downtown when I noticed someone watching me from across the room. Why does this therapist seem to think the fake workplace abuse left real marks when she was just acting the whole time? Something feels off about Ryan just happening to show up at her husband's parking garage right when things are heating up legally. One of Ryan's old drinking buddies just sat there staring with pure hate in his eyes while I tried to eat my steak. My security guy leaned over and suggested we should probably leave, but I kept eating and made eye contact right back until he looked away first. The next week, the FBI agent called me with news that made my stomach drop. They'd found evidence that Ryan and Nicole had been selling employee information from job applications to some identity theft ring for the past 2 years. Social security numbers, addresses, bank account info from direct deposit forms, everything these people trusted us to keep safe. Elena called me crying after her final interview with the board where they cleared her of criminal charges, but she still resigned anyway. She kept saying she should have protected those employees and asked how I stayed so strong through everything. The federal courthouse in downtown Columbus felt colder than I remembered when I walked in 5 months later for Ryan's criminal trial. They'd put me on the witness list as their star witness, and I saw him for the first time since that day at the store. He'd lost maybe 40 pounds, and his hair had gone gray, but his eyes still had that same look of contempt when he saw me walk in. The prosecutor had me play some of the worst footage for the jury, and I watched several of them physically pull back when they heard Nicole's comments about affirmative action. One older woman in the front row actually wiped tears when we played the audio of Ryan laughing about the employee who'd attempted suicide after he fired her. Ryan's defense attorney tried to make it seem like I'd tricked him into saying those things by acting incompetent on purpose. I stayed calm and told him I never asked Ryan to steal wages or call me stupid or grab that scanner and slam it down. The judge called a recess, and when we came back, the gallery had filled with former employees who'd driven from all over Ohio to be there. Some faces I recognized from the investigation, and others I'd never seen, but they all had that same look of hoping justice might actually happen this time. Marcus took the stand as part of his plea deal and pulled out this notebook Ryan had kept rating employees on how fast he could break them mentally. He admitted he'd helped with some of it, but claimed he was scared of becoming a target if he didn't play along with Ryan's games. The prosecutor saved the worst for last and played audio from a manager meeting where Ryan laughed about a teenage employee who'd tried to kill herself after he fired her for being 5 minutes late. Even Ryan's own lawyer looked sick when Ryan's voice came through the speakers saying she was too weak for the real world anyway, and maybe she'd done everyone a favor by removing herself from the workforce. The defense attorney called Ryan's own mother to the stand next, and she sat there looking at her hands while she admitted under oath that he'd always been cruel to anyone he thought was beneath him, even as a kid tormenting younger children and making the neighbor's daughter cry so hard she threw up. The defense attorney actually objected to his own witness when she kept going about how Ryan would steal lunch money and then tell the teachers the other kids were lying because they were poor and jealous. During the lunch break, I went to use the bathroom and heard someone crying in one of the stalls, and when Ryan's wife came out with mascara running down her face, she saw me and just froze before whispering that she knew what he was like but thought it was just at work, and it didn't matter as long as he kept getting promoted. 6 months had passed since that day in the store when everything came out, and now the jury only took 3 hours to reach their decision, while Jasmine sat next to me in the gallery squeezing my hand. The foreman stood up and read guilty on all counts while Ryan just stared straight ahead until it sank in. Then he jumped up screaming that the jury was biased against successful white men, and I was a corporate plant sent to destroy him for being too good at his job. The bailiffs had to drag him out in restraints while he kept yelling about discrimination, and how this was what happened when companies went woke and let women run investigations. I made it to my car before I started crying, not from sadness, but from 6 months of keeping everything inside finally breaking free, while my phone filled up with messages from former employees sending heart emojis and thank you texts. Nicole's trial happened 2 weeks later, but her lawyer had already worked out a plea deal for 18 months in prison, plus full restitution for the wage theft, and she couldn't ever be a manager again anywhere. The identity theft victims started coming forward after the news coverage. Over 300 people whose information Ryan and Nicole had sold to some guy running credit card scams, and the company got hit with a massive class action lawsuit for not supervising their stores properly. David announced his resignation to take responsibility, even though everyone knew he'd been trying to fix things. And 7 months after that day in the store, I got called into a meeting where they offered me a new position as vice president of employee advocacy with the specific job of making sure nothing like Ryan's store ever happened again. At Ryan's sentencing, he stood there in his orange jumpsuit, still insisting he was the victim of a witch hunt by people who couldn't handle honest management. So the judge added 6 more months for showing no remorse and gave him 8.5 years total. The young woman from the stockroom video reached out to me on LinkedIn a few weeks later, and when we met for coffee, she told me she was in college now studying employment law, because watching what happened made her want to be the lawyer who puts people like Ryan away. The threats started coming through my mailbox about a week after that coffee meeting, just typed notes saying they knew where I lived and what I'd done to good people who were just trying to make a living. My husband installed new deadbolts and a security system while I started taking different routes to work every day, checking my mirrors constantly for anyone anyone following me. We'd been talking about having kids, but now I couldn't stop thinking about what kind of world I'd be bringing them into, where people wanted to hurt me for doing my job. 3 months later, I stood in front of 200 corporate executives at our national conference in Chicago, clicking through slides showing the new protocols we'd developed based on what happened in Columbus. Anonymous reporting systems that went straight to corporate legal, monthly culture audits at every location, and most importantly, trained investigators ready to go undercover the moment we saw warning signs like mass resignations or unusual complaint patterns. The Department of Labor called me the next week with their final numbers from the wage theft investigation, and I had to sit down when they told me Ryan's district had stolen $1.3 million from employees over 5 years through unpaid overtime, deleted hours, and illegal deductions. We sent checks to every single affected employee with interest, and Thomas from legal told me later that some people called crying because they'd never expected to see that money again. Checks for $5,000 or $10,000 that meant they could pay off credit cards or catch up on rent. 8 months after everything went down, I got a call from the prosecutor saying Marcus had been arrested again for calling one of the witnesses and threatening her if she didn't change her testimony. They dragged him into court where he stood there in his orange jumpsuit yelling that I'd ruined his life over what any normal person would call regular workplace behavior, that making fun of stupid employees was just part of retail culture. The judge didn't buy it and revoked his plea deal, sending him to face the full charges, including witness tampering. That December, the store employees threw their first holiday party since Ryan had been fired, and they invited me to come celebrate on the same sales floor where he'd humiliated me in front of everyone. They'd created this wooden plaque they called the Ruby Award for Courage in the Workplace, and the new manager said they'd give it out every year to someone who stood up for what was right even when it was scary. A documentary filmmaker reached out through LinkedIn saying she wanted to tell the whole story with all the proceeds going to a fund for workplace abuse victims, and within days we had dozens of former employees volunteering to go on camera about what they'd survived under Ryan and his team. My husband finally convinced me to take a real vacation 6 months later, and we flew to this little beach town in Florida where nobody knew who I was or what had happened. I actually slept through the night for the first time in almost a year, and when he told me I'd really changed things, I finally let myself believe it might be true. The 1-year anniversary brought everyone back together for a memorial service for Sarah, the employee who'd tried to take her own life during Ryan's worst period, but thankfully survived. The prosecutor stood up during the service to announce that Ryan had just been convicted on all charges and would serve at least 15 years, but nobody cheered or celebrated because we all knew this wasn't really about punishment. 2 weeks later, the company settled the class action lawsuit for $50 million, with every penny going directly to employees who'd been hurt or had their identities stolen for Ryan's schemes. They liquidated everything Ryan owned to pay restitution, his house, his cars, even his boat, though it barely made a dent in what he owed. I spent the next month setting up our first nationwide undercover audit program, sending trained investigators to stores showing the same warning signs we'd missed in Columbus. Ryan's mom basically testified that her son was the neighborhood bully who made kids cry for fun, which really explains his management style perfectly. Some people just never outgrow being the worst kid on the playground. Within 30 days, we found and removed 7 managers who were heading down Ryan's path, catching them before they could destroy any more lives. My phone rang 6 months later while I was reviewing another investigation report. Jasmine's name appeared on the screen and I picked up immediately. She'd gotten into business school, she told me, her voice shaking with excitement. She wanted to become the kind of leader who protected people instead of destroying them. The Columbus store had transformed completely under new management. I visited it a year after everything happened and barely recognized the place. The new manager had framed my old seasonal employee name tag in her office. She showed me the employee satisfaction scores, the lowest turnover rate in the district, sales up 30%. The legal proceedings dragged on for months with appeals and hearings. Ryan's lawyer tried everything, but the evidence was too strong. The appeals court denied his request, and he started serving his full sentence. Nicole took her plea deal and served her time without making trouble. Marcus violated his probation by harassing a former coworker and got 2 years added to his sentence. The other managers from the district who'd been part of the toxic culture either got fired or quit before we could terminate them. 18 months after that Black Friday, I sat in a congressional hearing room wearing my old red polo shirt. The representatives asked about workplace abuse and what protections retail workers needed. I told them about the 2 weeks I spent being degraded and humiliated while pretending to be helpless. I showed them the statistics on turnover and mental health impacts. Several representatives said they'd never realized how bad things could get in retail. My husband and I had been trying to decide about kids for years. After the threats finally stopped and Ryan's supporters moved on to other things, we felt ready. He joked that any kid of mine would know exactly how to stand up to bullies. The body camera from my investigation sat in my desk drawer. Sometimes I picked it up and remembered those 2 weeks, the weight of staying silent while they insulted me, the strength it took not to reveal who I really was. The company board voted to implement what they called Ruby's Law. Any manager who got 3 employee complaints would trigger an automatic investigation. No more waiting for lawsuits or mass resignations. Turnover dropped 60% across all stores within 6 months. Other companies started asking how we'd done it and began creating similar policies. A thick envelope arrived from the state prison with Ryan's name on the return label. I handed it straight to Thomas without opening it. He filed it with all the other legal documents, but I never asked what it said. Ryan's words couldn't hurt me anymore. My office walls were covered with thank you cards from employees across the country. Workers who felt safer knowing someone was watching out for them. People who'd found the courage to report their own abusive managers. My assistant knocked on the door to tell me about another store showing warning signs, high turnover, multiple complaints, managers who seemed untouchable. I grabbed my briefcase and the investigation materials. There would always be more stores to check, more workers who needed someone to witness their truth. The work never really ended, but that was okay. Every investigation meant fewer people suffering in silence. Every manager we removed removed meant dozens of employees who could work without fear. Every policy change protected thousands of workers who deserved basic dignity and respect. Standing there ready to start another undercover assignment, I thought about how different things were from that Black Friday 3 years ago. The company had changed, the culture had shifted, and workers had real protections now. But most importantly, people like Ryan couldn't hide behind their positions anymore. They couldn't destroy lives while corporate looked the other way. Someone was always watching now, always ready to step in when things went wrong. And I would keep doing this work as long as there were people who needed protecting. Thanks for letting me wonder through all of this with you. Definitely been quite the journey. Until next time, friends, subscribe for more content like this.